So we're going to let people come in for a little while. Let people trickle in, and then I want to introduce everyone to Henry, my colleague who's helping to run the Zoom. This is Henry Coleman, and maybe you have a few housekeeping instructions, do you?
Sure. Yeah. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. So I'm just going to run through some admin tasks. The Q&As can get quite tricky with the amount of people that we have logging on. So there's a Q&A box that you can see down at the bottom of the screen next to where there's the chat button. Any questions, please do your best to put them in the Q&A box. It makes it much easier to manage. The chat will also be available for people to speak to each other. And if you want to be speaking to if you want your message to be seen by all the participants as well as the panelists, you actually have to change the default setting next to where it says to, change from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. And then everyone will be able to see your message. And what else?
Well, I'd like to ask everyone to please put in the box where you're from, because it's so exciting to have people. So far, we've had at least, I think, 75 different countries, or people from 75 different countries viewing the program, the World Localization Day program. And it's really exciting to see this global community, which we need to build up.
Fantastic. So we're getting a lot of people saying from Canada, Brazil, Australia, Argentina, so much. So that's awesome. And I'd also like to draw everyone's attention to the next steps that we hope people will take after this event. And they're all available on the World Localization Day website. There's 3 main things. One is to join the International Alliance for Localization. So you can register there, and that's an international network of people at the grassroots supporting localization. We also have a declaration, global to local declaration, that you can sign to express your affiliation and to express your commitment to these ideas. And then there's also a pledge that we're asking people to take, or inviting people to take. And that pledge aims to generate 10,000 actions over a month-long period for localization all around the world. And we have suggestions of what those actions can be, and you can kind of choose your own, or you can choose from the list of actions that we suggest. So yeah, that's a great way to keep things going on after this event. We also have a very active listserv and Facebook group with hundreds of IAL members all over the world. And so I'll add a link to the sign up in the chat box.
Yeah, in the IAL so far, I think we have about 58 countries. We'd love to see that increase, and the numbers increase greatly. Because without a really powerful global movement, we're not going to be able to make the sort of systemic change that we absolutely have to make. So I'd like to start by asking each one of you to introduce yourselves briefly. Zach, do you want to start? Oh, you're on mute. Okay.
I'm very glad to be here with all of you. Very honored. I'm Zach Bush. I'm a medical doctor from the United States. I was trained in internal medicine, then endocrinology and metabolism, and subsequently hospice and palliative care. During that time, I did research in beginning in mental health and then moving to cancer and chemotherapy development. That took me into the world of nutrition as I was working in vitamin A compounds for cancer therapies. Began to have a large degree of conviction that the pharmaceutical approach was not getting at the root cause of human disease. And so I transitioned to human health through nutrition and left the university in 2010. And for the last 10 years, I've been focused on the intersection of our food systems, human health and nutrition, the chronic disease epidemics, and the collapse of global health with ecology and the rest, moving into the 6th extinction. And so the root of all of those has, for me, become the microbiome and the study of bacteria, fungi, and the microorganisms that really have created life on Earth. And among these, at the highest level, is the virome. The viruses that have been so demonized recently, and in fact, for 100 years, really in recent months and years have been uncovered as the building blocks for life. And it's the really language of genomics and adaptation and biodiversification that is in the virome. And so my fascination is how nature loves to do biodiversity and communication at every level. And the virome is a powerful tool for universal communication and really singularity of life to push for its full potential.
Thank you. Such an important topic these days. And it's really thrilling to see how you've reached the whole world. We've heard from literally every continent about your work. Thank goodness your message is getting out. Charles, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just hearing Zach makes me want to just speak to what he said rather than introduce myself. But maybe I'll say that in a way, I'm working on a different aspect of the same reunion of ourselves as human beings with the rest of life, to restore the relationships that make us whole beings. So whether these are relationships to the microbial world or to local communities or to the ecosystem around us, I see the next evolution of our civilization to be a reclaiming of lost relationships, which comes from or is part of a change in our understanding of what a self is and who we are and why we're here. So I feel a natural alliance with people like Zach, and I guess in these times, there's just in the times of, well, I'm supposed to be introducing myself. I'm basically a philosopher, a writer, and until very recently a public speaker. Now I seem to be a internet speaker. So over to you, Alnoor, maybe.
Yeah, Alnoor, you're on mute.
Yeah, is my lighting a little bit better?
It's a little better, but you're still very hard to see.
I'm sorry, I'm in a dark room. Anyways, it is what it is. And nice to see everyone virtually and be connected in this quantum container or whatever the Zoomiverse is becoming. My name is Alnoor Ladha. I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of biographies. I feel like, it's just a reification of identity when identity is part of the problem, really. But I guess the social construct that I play with is the idea of being an activist and a writer. For the last 8 years, I've been part of an activist collective called The Rules, which is now closed as part of its sort of anarchist organizational structure, short periods of time. And so we spent 8 years looking at the root causes of inequality, poverty, and climate change, and what the alternatives are and could be to bring in a post-capitalist world, or worlds in a plural sense. And I'm currently in Costa Rica, and originally from Vancouver, and I come from a Sufi lineage. Thanks for having me, and beautiful to see everyone.
Well, I'm really honored to be here with the three of you, and a bit sad that Devita Davison hasn't been able to join us yet. Hope she still will. She's been doing really incredible work in Detroit in helping to build that amazing local food movement there. And so I'm Helena Norbert-Hodge from Local Futures, and for 45 years, I've been trying to raise awareness about the need for that reconnection that Charles is talking about, that need to reconnect to nature and to others, and how that helps us restore our inner reconnection. That as we've been driven away from the land, driven away from community, we have become frightened little fragments that are so easily manipulated. And we had last night, we had a webinar in another part of the world, and there were questions about the danger of the link between localism and nationalism, we see them as directly antithetical. I have witnessed in this remote culture of Ladakh in the Himalayas and also in Bhutan, how within just a decade and a half of the global economic system, which has been essentially the economy ever since we invented economics, what was born was a global system that destroyed self-reliance and self-respect, drove people off the land. It was fundamentally racist, misogynist, anti-nature from its inception, and it's actually continued to grow in the same direction, taking us further and further away from nature, further and further away from community. So mass urbanization is a consequence of this system, which has now become a corporate system driven by an algorithm in the financial markets. It's a madness. So reconnection is what we're encouraging, and that's what really localization can help us bring about. It can help us to decentralize and create not just one alternative system, but systems that truly respect and renew and strengthen the biodiversity as it was always linked to cultural diversity. And it's going to take global collaboration, global information exchange, and I believe to some extent, taking on some of the attributes of the dominant system in order to create enough of a countervailing force. And that to me comes back even to this business of biographies. And in my work in Ladakh, I used to ask my colleagues to dress up in little polyester suits and come out there looking like experts, because the world has fallen prey to the belief in expertise. And that means narrow, fragmented thinking. Narrow, fragmented thinking linked to mega scale. That's what's killing us. But I promise I won't talk so much. I think we're really ready to take some questions, Henry. I hope you have some.
Yep. So I did just get an email from Devita, and it seems her mum has just been rushed into hospital. So she's there with her. So she sends her apologies, and we send our best wishes to her. Our first question comes from Randy. Can more be said about the mental health implications of localization? It seems Ladakh was a model of secure attachment, which seems to be such a part of the ACE's approach. I don't know what that is, but maybe one of you do.
ACE, I'm not sure. Does anyone know what ACE is?
I could say something about the mental health. I mean, I think you'd probably agree, Helena, that when community dissolves, then and when relationships not only to community but to place, to the other beings of a place dissolve, our identity is our identity becomes weaker, because identity is created through relationships. So when our relationships are replaced by market mediated and technology mediated relationships, we don't actually know who we are anymore. And our psyche then becomes really unstable. But if we're held in community and in daily interaction with nature, and that would include the nature that Zach Bush talks about as well. Like, you know, you could tease out all kinds of mental health implications of a decimated microbiome. Like that's part of the relationships. So like fundamentally mental health, like the dominant system conceives it as the health of a separate individual that can be remedied if you go into therapy perhaps, or take some kind of pharmaceutical medication that fixes, you know, changes your brain chemistry, and then you're healthy again. But when we understand that the self is relationship, then nothing but the restoration of these relationships will bring mental health. So that's how I see the relationship with localization.
If I could just add too that this screen relationship, which used to be media imposing an image of who you should be, which has a profound effect on children in particular. They're these little beings looking for role models. absolutely soaking up what they see. And with this direction, economic pressure into the tiny nuclear family and more the screen being the role model, that immediately creates an image of perfection. And it used to be you were white or you were nobody. Now you're allowed to have a different skin color, but you've got to belong to the urban consumer culture, otherwise you're nobody. So all people connected to the land and connected to more traditional community structures are made to feel stupid and backward. Now the frightening thing is that the screen that children carry in their hands with their mobile phone is doing the same thing. Now they're doing it to each other. Ooh, they're having such a great time at that party. I'm not there. Ooh, don't they look sexy on that screen? And it's a wedge that cuts off the potential for real, genuine connection. And above all, what I saw traditionally is that when children model themselves on close proximity to real people, they never develop a sense that they have to be perfect. We are all imperfect. Life is imperfect. And that's one of the fundamental things. But Alnoor, I thought you spoke really beautifully to that too in our presentation when you talked about the importance of community.
Yeah, I don't fully remember what was said in that conversation.
It's very
but
beautiful.
Maybe just to add some context to the conversation around mental health is I don't think any interaction that's happening on the planet right now is happening outside of a construct of imposed capitalism, of neoliberalism. It is the oxygen by which we breathe, whether we like it or not. Every interaction is mediated by money, where we live, what we do for a living, how we spend our time. And you know what Charles is speaking to with the degradation of the relational fabric, and also the more metaphysical relationship with the human world, the more than human world, ancestors, etc. All of that has been commodified and transactionalized and cut off in the culture we live in. And you know, I think the old left had this fixation on critique, and that's sort of where it lived. That's where it sort of, let's say, its spiritual weight, you know, it was all given in that direction. And then the new age is sort of into this like spiritual bypassing. And I understand both sides of it, but it's like we need to bring the critique of our culture and the economic operating system into our work. We have to understand how the oxygen works, because that's going to help us learn what we don't want, which is as important as what we do want, and to build strong local communities and strong local economies. So yeah, I would just bring that more structural perspective and say how necessary that is in understanding how capitalism works as a contemplation, as an art of contemplation.
And the language too that you're using now, resistance and renewal, that we need both simultaneously.
Yeah, and that's, you know, very, very much inspired by you, Helena. Is like, many of us have spent years in resistance, and resistance is really important. You know, we have to remove the foot of capitalism and the noose of capitalism from the neck of 99% of humanity and all life, and we have to build the alternatives, and both have to happen simultaneously. There is no binary in it.
What I find so beautiful too is that one reinforces the other. Once we start a bit of a process of renewal, both that reconnection to community and the inner reconnection, we become stronger and healthier and more capable of resisting. And particularly when we turn the I to a we, you know, rather than thinking we're going to, as individuals, be the change we want to see in the world. This is how the corporate think tanks have managed to capture our imagination into an impossible, ridiculous path. Zach, do you want to say anything about that side of things, or shall we?
Yeah, I think just, you know, leapfrogging off of what Charles was saying there around relationship, and then Alnoor with, you know, the recognition of the social fabric, you know, both kind of being misplaced right now. And the microbiome has been a fascinating journey into understanding how community is done within nature, and community doesn't function well within any biologic system unless there's extreme diversity. And it's, you know, your point of nationalism is interesting. You know, as soon as you understand your identity to be somewhere other than global, i.e. here we are as a planet floating in the middle of vacuum space with the same number of water molecules, the same number of sodium chloride electrolytes that existed 4 billion years ago. This is a closed system, this thing that we call Earth. And so as we increasingly make division points on this globe and define ourselves and our identity by these ever slighter differences, we break down our understanding of what our purpose is within community. And one of the really fascinating, beautiful things that we've seen that really changed the course of my career is what happens in soil, whether that's on the ground that you walk on and grow your food or the soil of your gut. But in 2012, my chemotherapy research had been looking at the communication network between mitochondria, which are these little microorganisms that live inside human cells. They have their archaea. They're these ancient bacteria that are absorbed into a larger bacteria, and then both are thriving within a human cell. So the ovum that goes to the fertilization that will become a human is full of mitochondria. And there's extreme variation of biodiversity in the mitochondria. In fact, way more than typically seen in bacteria, fungi, and the like. These mitochondria can show up with, you know, you may have 200 to 2,000 mitochondria in a single cell. And within that, you may have hundreds of variants of the genomic information within those mitochondria. And so there's this just diversity within every single cell of these microorganisms. And my study of chemotherapy and cancer was understanding that the breakdown in this communication network, when the cell phone tower loses its power potential in the mitochondria and you can't get the signal out, you develop cancer. You can't kill the cell, and it goes on to do what we believe is this, you know, malignant process, when in fact it's a cell that just can't get its communication out or can't receive communication correctly. And when you put in something like super high dose vitamin A that triggers, you know, a big communication event, you can get that cell to kill itself, realizing that it's a cancer cell. And so as soon as it has enough information, it knows exactly what to do for the greater good of the whole. And so it was with some astonishment in 2012, after I'd left the university and was running a nutrition center in rural Virginia, a very impoverished community. I was trying to find a curriculum of nutrition that would work in food deserts to help reverse chronic disease. And the food wasn't working. We were, you know, pounding people with kale and Brussels sprouts and all the right things, and we were seeing inflammation go up. And it took a number of years before I believed that these people were actually eating what I asked them to eat. And to find out that the nutrition was capable of increasing inflammation was mind-blowing to me. And what we found as we drilled down into the soil in which that food was grown is that there was another communication network in the soil. And so just as we had seen communication happening between mitochondria, we uncovered in 2013 this communication network between bacteria and fungi in the soil systems. And fascinatingly, the herbicides and pesticides that we've used for our food system over the last decades has collapsed the cell phone communication there in the extracellular space. And so we started there asking, what are the bacteria and fungi doing? And in their production of this communication, wireless communication network, they were creating the capacity for cell-cell communication and intracellular communication on the human level to happen. And so similar to, per se, a cell phone that you've got in your hand, perhaps, in there is a transmitter and a receiver that always works. But if you're further away than 7 miles from the closest 4G tower, you don't have reception. Cell phone can't update its information, can't connect to the calendar, can't reach grandma by phone. And so you become an isolated organism. In the same way, when the extracellular matrix loses its bacterial and fungal communication network because of the antibiotic use in the environment, we get isolation at the human cell level. And the very first thing that happens at the human level when you lose that is a reduction in the capacity to make the proteins that give you self-identity. And so when you lose communication, you lose self-identity by losing what we call tight junctions. These are like the Velcro that hold the barrier systems together. So your gut membrane is the largest barrier in the body, but after that, the blood-brain barrier and the vascular system, the kidney tubules, these vast systems of bioidentity are eroded as soon as that telecommunication goes down, that are made by bacteria and fungi. And so it's showing us a really eloquent truth about life, is that at the foundation of life has to be communication. And if you perturb communication, the first thing that you're going to lose is self-identity. And you don't really get a fluent communication network in that microbial space until you get biodiversity. And so once you get, 5 million species of fungi and 30,000 species of bacteria and 300,000 species of parasites, all of these make a slightly different version of these carbon molecules that produce the communication network. And so as a whole, they will produce what is the equivalent of a liquid circuit board for nature to communicate through. But if you start to undermine biodiversity, you lose communication, you lose self-identity, you become isolated, and you become a cancer cell. And I would argue that humanity has become the cancer on the surface of this planet, and we are sucking the energy out of the planet just as a tumor would out of the body of a human, through which that isolation has caused the death.
I very quickly want to respond by saying I would be, I'm slightly worried that the measurement of that biodiversity, it might be something that exceeds our tools and abilities through conventional science. For instance, in Ladakh, where I worked for so many years, it's a desert landscape. And I remember agricultural experts coming out there and saying, this is impossible. How can they have such productive fields? They actually had higher yields than the average yields in America. And by the way, I also saw how the experts who came in with toxic chemicals to improve life, to bring progress, also underestimated those yields in order to justify and to pretend that they had increased yields, when very quickly they're killing the soil. But interestingly enough, even really well-intentioned, organically minded people who came in were saying, this is impossible. Where is the nitrogen fixation? It's just not there. I don't know. I just speculated that perhaps the amazing mineral wealth from the glacial meltwater played an important role that we can't even begin to calculate without being, in a specific ecosystem, which is why I'm so wedded to local knowledge systems and local ways forward. But we probably need to hear from more questions and not get too specialized.
So 2 related questions. First is from Camille in France. I've been a bit discouraged by some activists saying that small individual and community actions are amazing, but have very small impact compared to the production and influence of massive corporations, and that the only way forward is the disruption and destruction of these massive corporations. Please tell me this isn't the way to go. And then a related question, when the banks own the land and economical building materials don't meet with local regulations, how can those of us locked into racing to stay in place step out and reconnect to land to cultivate real food sovereignty and to re-establish community now and not later after regulations have been shifted?
Anyone want to go? I don't want to dominate too much. Alnoor, go on.
I nominate Alnoor. I think Alnoor needs to take that one.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really difficult question, and maybe I start with the first one around activism. Look, I agree. I think a lot of activism has become sort of anger-based and reactionary, and there's also truth in the fact that corporate power has amalgamated as such. And so I go back to, let's be good students of our culture. Let's understand how the system works. So how does it work? Well, it's just a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system, not unlike the biome. It's alive. Neoliberalism, modern capitalism. There's a set of rules that have been programmed. Those rules are generative. Compound interest, just a made-up fiction. It's a rule. The fact that we have to grow the global economy at 3% a year. Your growth has to exceed your interest rate in this existing system in order for that pie to keep on increasing. And that's an insane system. And in that system, whoever has the head start on capital, so if your interest rate is 1 or 2%, and your global economy is growing at 3%, but the return on capital is 5% or 10%, well, those people are going to get a bigger and bigger slice of the pie. That's how simple it is, right? You could read Thomas Piketty's 700-page book on this called Capital. And the gist of it is that the nature of capitalism is to concentrate wealth. The climate change, inequality, poverty, species destruction, the Anthropocene, these are not externalities. These are the logical outcomes of a set of rules. So knowing that, we're all going to play different roles in how we want to address that ecosystem. I don't tell other people I think they should be activists and fight the corporate system. That may not be their role. They may be musicians, they may be farmers, they may be poets, they may be philosophers, they may be whatever you want to do, but to be contextually relevant in troubled times requires an analysis of the problem and time spent in contemplation of that problem. And you may decide that you want to take the corporate Leviathan head on, and you may decide to operate within that system as an assassin. It's really up to you. And I don't think that, the problem with this idea of activists is like special people who do something here, the identity. And it's actually, as citizens alive in 2020 in Gaia, in the third dimension, it's our responsibility to understand what's going on, to be good students of our culture, and to act accordingly. And does it mean demolish corporate power? Well, that might be part of it. And it might also be that corporate power is already in its own undoing by us being conscientious objectors of a system that is destroying all of life. This is our option right now. We continue the growth-based train, or we're in a life-based systemic alternatives that are going to require sacrifices and us understanding the consequences of our actions. And it's not necessarily going to be easy. But I would say whatever we're doing now is not easy for anyone. It's even the 1%ers. It's deeply difficult. The amount of energy and resources, fossil fuel extraction, destruction of life, the karma that's being accumulated on a spiritual level, it's so difficult to keep this existing system in place. There's, constant printing of money, more ways to enslave human beings, more ways to liquidate resources, extract. It's a deeply difficult system. So I think part of the question is, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to reevaluate in our own lives in order to live those alternatives? And it doesn't have to be the destruction of the system or apocalypse or catastrophe as we thought it would be. It could be an emergent prayer that looks more like magic than it does like revolution.
Anybody else want to comment? Charles, you look like you're on the verge of it.
Yeah, I would love to hear Charles, because
yeah,
yeah,
a lot about
I
this.
can comment briefly on that. I mean, one thing is for sure that a future worth living in is not going to have the kind of corporations we have today. Whether that means that we destroy them or that they wither away, like the state in communism, I'm not sure. But in a way, corporations are just a symptom. They're a symptom and a cause of our current system. They are, because our current system is set up pretty much mathematically, as Alnoor was saying, to encourage those who are best at ruthlessly maximizing their return on capital. Corporations are a lot better at ruthless maximization than individual people are, who are encumbered by things like relationships and compassion and things like that. So you have corporations often taking actions that not a single person in the corporation would actually want to do. But as a collective, they can do those things. So one route to take would be to undo the corporation as we know it. But because the corporation is in large part a symptom, we also have to look to the structure of capitalism itself. And here, again, I don't so much go for an either or capitalism or socialism, but really to look at what is capital? Because the nature of capitalism depends on the nature of capital. What is capital? Capital ultimately is a system of agreements. Money, property, these are not features of reality outside of ourselves. Like the land doesn't know that you own it. You know, it's a social agreement, and social agreements can be changed. So what is the basis of the change of a social agreement? And that's not a trivial, there's no trivial answer to that question, but part of the basis of that change is our lived experience, the mythology through which we see the world. And so some people are called to spread change on that level. And maybe a musician or an artist or a poet, you know, is better able to foment a change in our consciousness, by which I really mean to bring things into consciousness that were not present before. And this is not only our intellects, but also our lived experience of being. So we get, I mean, because you could also say that capitalism itself is based on trauma, that it is traumatized. Now, part of the trauma comes from capitalism. So we have a self-reinforcing system here, where the consciousness creates the system and the system creates the consciousness, which makes it seem like we're kind of stuck. But it also tells us that we can act on any of these levels and be part of the solution, which is why I guess speaking for myself, but I think many people would share this experience of the feeling of an alliance with somebody, but you're working on totally different things. You know, one person's working on the gut microbiome, and somebody else is on local food systems or prison reform or hopefully abolition. And it's like, we're all actually part of the same thing. So, you know, maybe we have different opinions here about what is the highest leverage point, the highest impact leverage point, and here's what everybody should be doing. But I tend to be a little bit wary of grand plans and formulas that tell everybody what they should be doing. I prefer to come together in a common understanding and a common story that unifies us and calls forth the unique gifts of each person as applied to the unique circumstances that they are in. I hope that wasn't too abstract, but.
Well, I'd like to make that more specific and say that for us, localization is clearly that way of allowing and creating the space for that reconnection and for the diversity that's absolutely essential. And it sounds like it's this single formula being imposed. It's exactly the opposite. It's the sort of ultimate in an ism. Localism is sort of the ism that would end all isms, because the problem is isms. And I think when we look at, you were talking about social arrangements, and Alnoor, you were mentioning Piketty. And you see, for me, Piketty reached the world hugely, New York Times, everywhere, because he did not address the path whereby capitalism was being put on steroids through trade treaties. He didn't even mention them. So that has been the path that has quietly been going on, and we sort of hear about it, but that's the arena where corporations have been giving governments their marching orders. That's where they have changed the rules. The arrangements, the social economic agreements have been a transference of power to supposedly democratic governments to global banks and corporations through this series of trade treaties. And so I think pointing that out and being aware of that, I think, is vitally important. And that's why, you know, the people who have been pointing that out, you don't get to hear about. They just don't make it into the New York Times. They don't even get to be seen on Facebook because they're addressing this systemic path that is transferring power into this monstrous algorithmic, you know, way of dealing with the world. But on the other side, where people do start reconnecting, you see this amazing transformations. I mean, I'm seeing prisoners, juvenile delinquents, people, addicts, you know, entrenched addictions changed as people are helped to connect to each other and to the living world in that deeper spiritual path of reconnection. So to me, I think as large and horrible and evil as that system is, I ultimately see people and nature, that's where the real power is. And every day, as the economy centralizes power and wealth more, the number of people who are supposedly benefiting gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And we are the fools, you know, the vast majority of people on this planet who don't wake up to the process whereby that's happening and don't, and you know, we need a movement that will be looking at immediately regulating this cancerous growth of corporate power and deregulated finance, a casino economy, regulating that to shrink them down to size so that every business adheres to the rules that are subservient to genuine democracy. And the way you do that is to decentralize as much as possible. So everything that can happen at a more local level, the sort of principle of subsidiarity, that's where you can start actually in practice living diversity, living community. I hope that makes sense. It's a lot to unpack. Henry, yeah.
Go ahead, Henry.
Or Zach, do you want to comment?
I'd love to hear Zach. Yeah.
Go on, Zach.
Either way, I think it points to a couple other questions that have come in here around, you know, Camille from France, for example, is discouraged by some activists saying that small individual and community actions are amazing, but they don't have the same impact as these huge, massive corporations. And I think that's one of the powers that is currently used by the status quo that's out there, is trying to convince us that there is no power big enough to take it down, you know. And so there's a desire for us to kind of give into this hopelessness, because it's actually simpler. You know, that's like, oh, we can't do anything about it, and so we won't do anything about it. You know, so I think that's really the only thing that we face now is our own belief system about these corporations. We are the fuel for those corporations. There is not a corporation that I know of that doesn't run on consumer power. And that includes the governments of every nation run on those tax dollars. And so we have nothing to fear but fear itself, which is us. We are afraid of our own potential. And what Alnoor is laying out there as an alternative for us, you know, and, you know, Charles, in your essay that you wrote on the coronation, I think is such a good example of what we have the opportunity to literally step into the royal blood that we are, you know, really devised from. We are devised from this extraordinary, you know, identity as ancient souls, perhaps, that are now in these bodies, and we're not stepping into that power. And so we use our own storytelling about these corporations to make it sound hopeless that our daily efforts are going to go unfulfilled or unsuccessful. And it's a total storytelling mission, because it's not real. These corporations have nothing. And every year that goes by, they have less, because there is no backing to the US dollar. The US dollar is a figment of mathematical creation on screens. And so it's just a bunch of ones and zeros in the computer virtual realm. That's what they run on. And so we should look at that and laugh and say, why do they think for 2 seconds that they have any power over anything? They have no real wealth. They have no real anything. And I would include myself in that. As an American citizen, probably in the top 1% of wealth in the world or whatever it is, I have nothing. Right now, I'm just south of Harlem, and it's an exciting time. My daughter's living here, and it's an exciting time to visit here because of the energy that's in the community here right now. It is activated, and it is seeing its own value, perhaps better than it's ever been able to express it. And, you know, there was a huge bike, you know, demonstration that just happened yesterday with thousands and thousands of bicyclists chanting and riding down 3rd Avenue through this whole east side downtown, all the way downtown. And so this massive bike rally. And that's not been seen before. And so I have this sense of like, we're about to see not the corruption, not some deep state, not the, you know, the darkness. We're about to see what we're capable of. And it doesn't fit any previous story that's been told. And so the coronation essay, I don't know if something comes to mind, Charles, as you want to throw in on that, but I think you were really speaking to this raw potential that we have there.
Yeah, it's possible that this Black Lives Matter will be like the last brick in this edifice, you know, to now go, and that things will start really falling down. And as you say, particularly, I mean, you know, you and I might have a house, we might own some land, and so we do have something, and maybe we have some community as well. But these dollars, these zeros on a computer screen are literally not worth anything now because of the deregulation of completely moving away from any standard, no gold standard, no dollar standard. It's just completely.
And I would argue that anybody who's lived through the collapse of an empire would say that their house isn't actually theirs either. They realize that everything can be taken away from you in a moment's time.
Yeah.
And so we should never think that we own the land that we stand on. I think all indigenous peoples realize that's probably the first fallacy of Western civilization, is believing that you can own land. It's only owned as long as you have a story of dominance. And then if somebody comes away along with a more dominant story, it's not yours anymore. So, you know, it's so temporal and it's so ethereal, but what is not temporal and ethereal is what you hit on after that statement, is we have relationships. And so ultimately that comes back to your first statements, Charles, is that what defines us is relationship. We are defined within relationship. We become useful within relationship. We become on purpose within relationship.
But I would also argue that having lived in cultures where there was a certain degree of organic ownership of land that was more community owned, and, you know, an extended family did own land, and then there were commons that were shared in a very organic way, I would say that, that there is a grounded relationship that in most cultures, when you go further back, was perhaps not demarcated, but certainly there are many cultures that for thousands of years actually practiced agriculture and owned land, but in a fundamentally different way from what modern Western society has done.
I would guess that it was more a sense of stewardship rather than ownership. That was the sense, absolutely. But it was still, you know, this belongs to this particular village, and this belongs, you know, these are their commons, and it operated at a scale and in a way that I think is so important for us to be aware of, because I think when we have the image that there will be absolutely no ownership, and perhaps that it was only pre-agricultural society that knew how to live with the land, and that we have to go back to that, it becomes extremely difficult to even imagine a situation that could work for these almost 8 billion people. Whereas what our experience is rooted in, and not just in Ladakh and Bhutan, but working with Via Campesina, you know, 200 million small farmers around the world. There are lots of examples of ways that worked infinitely better, and perhaps never perfect, never, you know, always organic, always changing, always adapting, but scale was the fundamental factor there. Alnoor, you disappeared, but you're back on.
Yeah,
Let me take
sorry.
another question. The questions around communicating localization. There are a few questions about it. I'll read out two. One's from Jeremy. How might localization help depolarize our societies and our narratives? How can we bridge those gaps, bring the message to all sides of an ever increasingly polarized world? And this one from Ulf. How do we compete with the massive misinformation spread by the super spreaders of TV, screens, media, money, etc., with our little organic neighborhood chat? So how do we communicate this?
Well, I mean, having been trying to communicate about localization for a long time, I'll go first on that. And I believe that the vision, the image that everywhere in the world, local economies need to thrive is a vision that can and does appeal even to small business owners and farmers who may have been manipulated into voting for demagogues who have told them, you know, government out of the way, laissez-faire economics, we're fed up with all these regulations, we're going to grow the economy for you. These demagogues who are doing that are actually growing the economy for global corporations, for the less than 1%, for the 8 men that own more than half the global population. So once that, you know, is spelled out and you talk about how can we in your city, in your neighborhood, create much more human scale businesses. So we're talking about a growth. We're talking about a growth in the number of businesses. We're talking about not being dependent on 10 global conglomerates for our seeds, for our water, for our pharmaceuticals. We're talking about a growth in the number of businesses. We're talking about a decentralization that is fundamentally linked to the necessity of restoring biodiversity and localizing that shortens the distances between production and consumption at a human scale, does that and is proving that it can do that. And even when it comes to international trade, well, there's just too much to say and I'll dominate too much. But I think what we're also seeing is as we're helping to restore that interdependence in the city, in smaller towns, as people become dependent on those human beings over there, suddenly, whatever their race, whatever their nationality, whatever the differences, they recognize that the I has turned into a we. We depend on each other, we support each other. And we don't realize the extent to which every polarization and mad prejudice grows when people are reduced to a concept. You know, the Chinese are this. People who've never been in China, or possibly never even met a Chinese person, are getting fed fixed concepts of what these people are. The Muslims, they're all, you know, a threat to all of us. The reducing either nature, the plants, the animals, the human beings, any of life into a concept with no experiential foundation, that's one of the roots of prejudice and violence and conflict. And then when you have people who know each other by name and who were living side by side, suddenly thrown into the city, fighting for scarce, artificially scarce jobs, then you can create violent bloodshed and friction between people who do know each other. But when you do the opposite, instead bring in a formula that allows them to cooperate and to collaborate and to become interdependent, it has exactly the opposite effect. Not always perfectly and not always inevitably, but it is definitely proving itself to work in that way. Any critical comments from any of you guys where you disagree? I'm sure you must a bit, because I'm pretty extreme. Even on World Localization Day, Charles, I'd be happy to hear. But actually, yeah, what are the nuances of differences? I know they're small.
I mean, I resonated with what you said. To go back to the question itself, one thing that might be useful in our communication is to speak to that within most people in a modern society, which feels a loss of the embedded relational community that is natural to human beings, and which that loss of community, that loss of connection to a place which by the way has been intensified by COVID-19, where people don't even go to the local branch of the supermarket anymore, but order things to come directly to their house, like plugged into even more plugged in than before to a globalized distribution machine. But I think that if we can name the loss and speak to the loss and speak to the knowledge that there is a possibility of recovering these lost connections, and point out, like, part of the, here's a problem that I find with a lot of the left critique of the system, which is the phrase that the whole system is only benefiting the 1%. It's only benefiting, a small privileged subset of the population. That critique in itself encodes values of privilege that upholds the, Southampton or Beverly Hills resident as like the pinnacle of progress in human joy and well-being. But if you actually want to find a happy person, you will not find them, generally speaking, in Beverly Hills or Southampton. You will find them in, a Caro village in Peru. You will find them in a remote village in Ladakh. You'll find them, you're not going to find them in the mansions and the gated communities. So, like, I think that if we can name that, this isn't working for anybody, and to give people examples and stories and maybe even experiences of what life is like in deeper connection to place, to community, to an ecosystem. At least it gives some kind of focus to this inchoate longing that otherwise gets satisfied, or at least temporarily met, with even more of the addictive consumption that constitutes the so-called benefits of the elite. Now, I'm not saying that like, yeah, if you take for granted the current social order, then it is better to be among the privileged than it is to be living in a slum or a ghetto somewhere. Although even that's kind of debatable in certain ways. I was in Favela de Paz in Sao Paulo a couple of years ago, walking with this guy, and like, people were poor there. There was, people were literally dirt poor, as in the floor is made of dirt poor, okay? And yeah, sometimes people were hungry, I mean, it wasn't like, we can't idealize it, but every single person that passed us by in the street was an acquaintance of my friend Bruno, I think it was. And he knew this, like, and he was through an interpreter. He could tell the story of every single person we encountered. That guy, he's an alcoholic. He makes trouble sometimes, but like that kid, wants to be a soccer star or whatever. Like every single person had a story, and there were kids running around in gangs all over the place, and every face that the child saw was somebody who knew that child well, knew where they lived, would look out for them. And I'm like, and I described to him what suburbia has become in America. And I'm like, we walk down the street and you don't even, or more usually drive down the street, emerge from your garage, drive down the street, and you don't know even who lives in most of these houses or anything about their lives. And you certainly don't know where their grandfather came from. And there are no kids playing outside. And he's like, man, that sucks. And I was almost like, we should make like ecotourism tours, like take people from, favelas or like Amish villages here and take them on tours of like these, because all they see is in the media, where everybody looks, as Helena has said before, looks like they never work and they live in the lap of luxury. And the reality, the depression, the suicide, the anxiety, the medication, the obesity, the autoimmunity. I mean, the reality is that, this it's not just like some philosophical, spiritual missing thing. The truncation of all of these relationships, it affects our bodies and affects our minds. So I think that we don't have to shame and guilt people into change. And you know, you're an exploiter and you're using more than your share of resources. Whether or not that's true, you could also say, hey brother, is this really working for you? Can any amount of wealth and success protect you from your teenager getting addicted to something? Can it protect you from divorce? Can it protect you from loneliness? So when we come with that spirit, and this applies to many, many dimensions of social change, not just localization, but when we come with that spirit, we come as the friend and not the opponent of those who we hope will let go of their hold on the systems of this planet.
I mean, I have to tell you that, you know, we have been doing reality tours both ways, exactly with this kind of thing in mind. And we used to do plays in Ladakh. And, you know, one of them was called A Journey to New York, of a Ladakhi who traveled to New York, having been led to believe this was paradise. They had assumed that they had everything that they had, plus the most amazing buildings and things, and then lives there for a while and discovers the loneliness and the depression and you know, how people, you know, are actually quite miserable, you know, goes back home and reports that it's not at all what he thought. But I remember also in our ecology center in Ladakh years ago, I just was looking at my diary from the UK and I saw this long list of phone numbers of people you could call if you were suicidal, if you were alcoholic, if you were addicted, if you were being, you know, abused by your husband. There's this long list of numbers. I put it up on the wall and I said, it's interesting that here in Ladakh, there's no need for any of those numbers. And the anger I got from Westerners was really remarkable. So in a way, it is about exposing our poverty in the West. We've been buying into this myth that by being herded into the city and having more and more stuff, we've been happier and happier. We've been told, what's wrong with these teenagers? Why are they taking drugs in these cultures where they have everything? Everything. No community, no time to be and to do and to love and to laugh and to make music, to be alive. Pressured from before birth to compete, to do well in school, you know, to be somebody because you're never good enough just the way you are. So exposing that poverty at the same time as attracting them to the richness of what life could be, and to somehow do that in a way that doesn't seem, you know, too unrealistic. Or I actually feel right now our best news stories for that come from the localization movement, come from the hubs around the world where people have started coming together to live differently and have chosen a more community-based, nature-based life, which is what it's all about. And that's what you've done, Alnoor.
I don't know about that. Yeah, I'm just in an inquiry and a feeble attempt, really. And maybe I just add something in, because I think a lot of the questions and even our responses make it seem like there is a way to do it, even though I know, you know, none of us believe there is. But to say that, I think what's happening right now in a very significant way is we're being initiated into non-dualistic thought, to hold multiple ideas simultaneously without conflict. And yeah, look, the system's not working for anyone, including the 1%, and yet it's working for them enough in a way that matters to them at their level of consciousness right now. And if material accumulation is all they have, at this point, they would continue to push that agenda and destroy all of life in its wake. And so if people want to resist that, I support their resistance of that. And I do think that look, at a cosmos, there's only the cosmic consciousness and unity consciousness, and we non-dualistically, we are living individual lives in our incarnated bodies with responsibility, with agency, with karma, and that matters. And this non-dualistic thought can also be applied to the question around activism. It's like, yeah, what you do at a local level, if you are doing it of pure intention and you are a student of your culture and you understand the impoverishment of your time, truly understand what Western culture has done to this planet, what you do matters on an individual level. And we have to fight power structurally. And we've all benefited from that. We've benefited from social movements risking their lives to have the civil rights movement and the suffragette movement. And, we are an accumulation of all of that. So we actually need an ecosystem of approaches. And if people want to treat Donald Trump like their enemy, I would say, look, there's spiritual implications to doing that. And I'm not opposed to it. Yes, there's a 1%er in all of us. And that person also has agency and responsibility. And we should acknowledge that. And so I just bring that angle in. And also just to say something about localization and how we communicate it. I think that there's a fallacy in communication called the awareness knowledge gap, that we think people just don't have awareness. And if we give them that awareness, their knowledge will be fulfilled and they'll just know. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's about how sophisticated our arguments are. I think people have to have the lived experience. And what Charles said really resonated with me, is that there is an imprint within us that understands this more tribal way of living. And so how do we help people create the context where they feel that experience? And the communication to me is very contextual. In certain communities, I think of localism as anarchism, which is not anarchy. Anarchism is a very sophisticated political philosophy, but it's really about self-governance, self-organization, the community's ability to decide what matters to them. And look, climate change is going to force us to live in small autonomous communities. We have 10 years, maybe 20 years left max of the existing system. In our current plan, if we just go as is, we have to double the global economy in 20 years at 3% growth, which is obviously not going to happen for infinite reasons. But we can start to build that local economy and community now and start learning what it is to live transition infrastructure and use the capital we have to build the post-capitalist world. Or we can wake up in dystopia and realize that we have very little time to organize ourselves in that way. And I think that it's not the most sort of eloquent decision process to give people, but I feel like it's very real. It's like, we have 10 years left of the Western way of living. Like, it's up to you and how you want to live this reality. And we know the people who are going to survive climate change are indigenous people who have local knowledge and deep ancestral connections to their land, and people who are self-sovereign and food sovereign. Because if you don't have a relationship with your food, like when the globalized system collapses, which it will, we can't continue on as we are. And this is what COVID is telling us. It's like, this is the relationship with the natural world. When you encroach that, and you're dependent on your asparagus to come from Thailand to New York in December or whatever, that's a system failed for collapse. And so this is the moment, in this very little period of time, this small window of time, where capital, for all its ills, is also a way to organize human labor. And we have this short period of time to use what we have to build something else. And that's the possibility that exists right now.
So, basically, that was a very strong plea for helping people to get organized into local communities connected to the land. And I think that my big worry has been for a very, very long time that the casino economy may be the last thing to collapse. Once we've allowed this artificial creation of money and this pretense of power through zeros on a computer screen to continue to live and to dominate our governments, to shape our media, to shape education, to shape every avenue of knowledge, and now also the internet, dominated by that fake money and that monolithic for-profit view, for profit for the few. I just worry that the casino capital may live on till the last tree falls. So that's why I'd like us to encourage that people do get organized into those more organic, ecologically based, community-based ways of living as quickly as possible, while naming the problem. And I do believe it is about a lack of awareness. Most people have not been informed. The channels of information have been shut down. They've been so manipulated. These enormous environmental meetings starting in Rio, Habitat in Istanbul, and those are like landmarks for co-opting and manipulating the entire environmental and social movements into an agenda that believed in sustainable development as the way forward. And we have, there's just a lot of work to be done to re-educate people there, or to decolonize their minds. And we don't have many channels, to reach them with that. Even just the wake up to the healing that can come through deep community and connection to nature, which I see so many projects playing out, but almost all of it ends up being elitist because it requires the money of people who are able to liberate themselves from this system. So the sort of things that should be happening in healthcare, in prisons, which, as Charles was saying, we should be abolishing altogether, those things are not happening because the capital, that fake capital, is taking everything in the opposite direction. So we need both sides.
There are two kind of groups of questions I'd like to get to in the next 15 minutes. I wonder if you can do this one relatively quickly. There are a few questions coming up around what is the role of government in all of this? What is the role of the global in the local, also like global institutions, UN, World Health Organization, World Economic Forum? How can we actually reimagine government in localization, in a localized world? And how do we use those tools rather than, and not just kind of abolish them and not use them?
Who would like to go first? Zach?
I think I'm outgunned on this one probably by everybody else on here as far as, looking at those larger governmental systems. I can reflect from my limited worldview, which in the end is a pretty large chunk of the economy, which is the healthcare system. When you look at healthcare, it is about 5 to 7x the size of our military budget now in the United States. And so we spend about $3.7 trillion a year on chronic disease management. And when you look at its entrenched relationship to government, they have to be all together or that system fails. And so the current role of government right now is to palliate a failing system is how it works. And so in the end, we don't need to fear the governments any more than we need to tell ourselves a story that these companies are too big for us to take over or too big for us to change. The governments are fully deployed right now. And I think that if you look at the rate of aging in any nation state leader, it gives you a reflection of the amount of stress they're under, because right now governments are being stretched to their very limits of capacity of human ingenuity, human productivity to palliate a broken healthcare system globally. And so now that we're spending more money managing our own chronic disease and collapse of biology than we are in fighting wars, that's a first. We've always spent more money fighting wars and winning empires than ever before. And now when you see this pandemic happen, I'm convinced that you're seeing governments worldwide have to utilize healthcare as a justification to consolidate wealth now. And so the story of the pandemic, the story of all this fear and everything else was demonstrating to us just how far down the track governments are of no options left. And so they are utilizing the last straw in their repertoire now to convince us to let wealth be consolidated one more time into the hands of a few. And it's become so blatant. I mean, you literally have every news channel in the world with Dr. Fauci and all of these pseudo-elected officials, which aren't elected at all, placed there by business and academia in their positions, saying that they're going to pump $500 billion into pharmaceutical companies to develop a theoretical vaccine. And nobody blinks, like $500 billion. And if we did that to correct the prison system and to actually start education throughout that whole sector, we would radically change GDP. We would radically change, long-term trajectory of wealth and all of that in all of the countries of the world. If we just did that in one country. So I don't think it's a state of idiocy, which I am always tempted to believe whenever you see politicians get up and say, there's a temptation to think these guys are idiots. But I think that what's really happening is they are stretched beyond human capacity to try to stabilize a system that they've been mandated to stabilize. And it pulls them into the fool card all the time. But I think if we make the mistake of believing that they're fools, we're going to fail to see our own foolishness, which created the paradigm that they're trying so hard to palliate.
I mean, I wouldn't say fools, but I certainly see blindness and over-specialization as the mechanism whereby they are defending their positions. They're adhering to the dogma of growth and of course health. The whole paradigm of health has been wrong from, again, essentially since natural healthcare and homeopathic treatments and so on were shut down. So we've had a wrong model as a foundation of our scientific worldview for a very long time, and it's just been escalated into a blindness that it ends up being idiotic, I would say. And the same thing with growth. I mean, it literally is a measurement of breakdown. That's what it is. When we stay healthy, no money exchanges hands, GDP will go down. You plant a garden, bad for GDP, you're being unpatriotic. I mean, it's an absolute madness, but we're all mad. We're all in this together. We've bought into it. Charles, you were going to say something.
I wasn't really going to say something. I'm just kind of taking it in. I mean, I have a lot I could say, but I don't have to.
Oh, we would like you to.
Well, I was kind of in my mind connecting what Zach was saying about palliative, palliating the symptoms, like an entire system, an entire political system geared around somehow doing our best to make things work. And an earlier comment that Alnoor was making about, we only have 10 or 20 years. And Helena, it sounded like you were actually subtly taking exception to what Alnoor was saying. Like maybe the financial system will be the last thing to fall until every single tree is chopped down. And I kind of sympathize with that viewpoint because just on a gut level, this has come to me a bunch of times. I don't think that collapse is going to save us. I don't think that climate change is going to save us. I don't think that it's going to force us to make the changes that we need to make in order to live in what I call a more beautiful world. But I think that what we are being presented with each crisis and with each intensification of the oppressive mechanisms, whether they are economic or medical, of the status quo, is that we're being offered a new choice point. We're being asked, hey, here's where we are going. Here is the next future, further consolidation of wealth, further, like what Zach was saying, like with COVID-19, there has been a massive destruction of small business, a massive destruction of local economies all over the world, tremendous concentration of wealth. The people who have suffered by far the most are like day laborers in India, and not the people who are, well, working from home isn't so bad. Like huge numbers of small businesses have been wiped, like gone forever. The National Restaurant Federation estimates that 85% of independently owned restaurants are going to be out of business, et cetera, et cetera. Farmers markets have been decimated. So in this, so here's a kind of a parallel to this palliative medical system that Zach was talking about in terms of food and in terms of the basic systems of human survival that are seemingly threatened by climate change, well, they come in with the next palliative technical fix, which is precision fermentation and lab-grown meat, which was celebrated, by George Monbiot. I don't know if it's pronounced Monbiot or Monbiot. Monbiot.
Yeah.
Celebrated by him, and bless his heart, he's like, farming is so destructive. And if you take for granted what farming has been industrially, then yeah, it's great. We don't have to do farming anymore, because traditional and new, both methods of farming that actually restore and regenerate and replenish land, those are not really so much in the consciousness of the let's save the world through technology crowd. So anyway, what I am afraid of is actually, in a way, Alnoor, you're more optimistic than I am, because what I'm afraid of is that climate change won't save us, and that our destiny will be to live on a planet that has been converted into one gigantic strip mine and parking lot with bubble cities and bubbles around ourselves to protect us from the scary viruses and the toxic chemicals that we've put out into the environment, and that will be considered progress. And that, in fact, we have been marching towards such a future for a very long time. And I'm like, if climate change were going to save us, if ecological, because I actually think climate change is a facet of a much deeper problem. But if ecological collapse, if the dying of the biosphere, if the extinction of species, if that were going to save us, it already would have. So what I ask is, if we are not going to continue choosing a deader and deader planet, what has to change for us to choose something else? Where has that choice come from? Because what I'm afraid of is not that our technological means are insufficient to the task of survival in a dying biosphere. My fear is that they are sufficient for it, and that we will accept that as an okay future. And if I'm seeing excessively pessimistic here, consider the extent to which that has already happened. So for me, it's a matter of tremendous urgency. Yeah, maybe we will be forced to make the changes that I think will only come from love. Maybe fear will force us to change, but even if, we're still only operating with half a deck, if we also don't speak to the amazing, glorious, rich possibility of life reunited with place, with community, and with nature.
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree with you. Alnoor, what do you say?
Mm-hmm. But look, the reality is I have no clue, right? That's the truth. Is none of us know, right? And I think we're all in an earnest inquiry about this, and that's beautiful. And I don't think that the past is an indicator of the future, because we are at the edge of consciousness. We're in an emergent reality right now. And look, the last, and I totally agree with Charles on this, that climate change is just one facet of a deeper ecological breakdown. And when we just look at the climate change aspects, the last IPCC report, the panel on climate change, has 40 plus feedback loops, just one of which is the Siberian ice sheets, holds 12 times more carbon in the form of methane. And then the Exxons start drilling in that area because it's melting. And, so we mess with nature on this level. What's coming? We have no idea. We have no idea. A 3.5 degree rise temperature is correlated with 40% biodiversity loss. You remove one thing from an ecosystem, you can have collapse. 40% of all life. And then, that's correlated to a 10 or 20 meter sea level rise. When you're facing that level of catastrophe, as we are essentially creating the context for, the debt-based dollar, which is just an IOU, is going to collapse completely. Who's going to fly the private jets of 1%ers, and who's going to guard their gilded gates when there's complete chaos and breakdown? And I just don't think we know on what level sort of climate change is coming. And I also hold those same concerns as Charles. And part of me also feels that what's really at stake is human life, right? Because if we started building the transition infrastructure now, more human beings would be able to survive if we chose to live in symbiosis with nature and return to the original instructions and the knowledge we ancestrally had. And that choice exists, and it looks like we're not choosing that. And I don't think the growth-based model is a conspiracy. I think it's this simple. If 93 cents of every dollar after the multiplier end up in the hands of the top 1%, there's going to be no other strategy except to grow GDP. That's where we're at. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just the nature of this complex game right now. And so we have a choice. Are we going to build transition infrastructure outside the debt-based system? You know, I'd encourage people to read Sacred Economics and to look into what a demiurge currency would do, a currency not based on debt, with potentially a debt jubilee and a direct democracy and UBI that's tied to a non-debt-based dollar and degrowth economics and localization. Like, these alternatives all exist. And the one line, simple line to end with is, what's the role of government and institutions? It's to localize power. That's it. If they're not doing that, they're useless to us.
Well, I would also add that we could insist that they protect us from the predatory nature of that global capital. And where I disagree with you a little bit is that we have to remember that governments themselves are being impoverished relative to this artificial creation of money. So they're going with their begging bowls to big business saying, PPP, please let's have a public-private partnership, because they are now poorer than this interlinked de facto sort of empire of make-believe money linked to the giant pharmaceuticals and military industry and so on. So really, really, we need to watch out for the techno path now with digital money, the Internet of Things, and 5G taking us another huge leap in the direction of a techno path that centralizes power at every level and beyond the nation state. So the nation state could be a tool if we are at the table, civic society, the movement at the table, to ensure that with the current nation state, we insist on taking the power back from this de facto empire. That's how I see it. And as simultaneously decentralizing power as much as possible, particularly when it comes to the real economy, the food, above all, food, but then the water, the building materials, the basic needs for, not just for survival, but for that beautiful world. That's all we need. We don't need all that other consumer junk and gadgetry, and we never have, but it's been foisted on us. I just also want to say that we do get every day in our inbox examples of these amazing initiatives that are happening. And I do want to say, we were talking about farmers markets having been damaged, but I do also get reports from all over the world that COVID woke people up to the need to be nearer their food and to start growing things. And seeds were sold out, seedlings were sold out all over the world. In Japan, they've now managed to make a bit of a dent in trying to protect their native seed varieties, which now the pharmaceutical empire, the corporate empire is trying to push the national government to remove the protection they have of their native biodiversity. So there has also been a real awakening in terms of food and community, and we're getting the impression that it's been quite significant. Let's just hope it keeps growing. And thank you so much, gorgeous, wonderful man. And I'm just very honored to be working with you. And I hope, Zach, that you're going to join our alliance and that we'll see more of you. Love you all. And thank you all for joining, all the rest of you who have been listening in. Do stay in touch. Thank you very much. And thank you, Henry, for a great job.
No worries.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for
everybody.
joining. WorldLocalizationDay.org. You can sign up to the IAL, take the pledge of action, and sign the Global to Local Declaration. So, see you there.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.